Greeting, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Stan Houston. Interesting ideas, sometimes inspiring ideas, always some good stories. And today I've invited a friend of mine to tell a very special story that came from his life just about 60 years ago this month. His name is Jim McKay, and he was born and raised in the Rochester, New York area. He graduated from Penn State University with a major in math and economics and a minor in marketing. And he was commissioned a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Air Defense Command through the Penn State ROTC program. And then something happened. Following his military service, Jim joined Eastman Kodak Corporation, serving a 40-year career in the motion picture and television line business, dealing with Hollywood and television during their golden era. During his corporate career, he did some graduate study in computers at the University of Rochester. Later, he was fortunate enough to receive an honorary doctorate from Columbia College in Hollywood. And that was in recognition of his Kodak corporate worldwide student program initiatives with universities all around the world. And a remarkable man. And now, of course, he's like me. We are a little bit aged, but we had stories from our youth that perhaps can resonate even with you today. And if you are of our age and stage, you'll probably find them interesting too. So I'm going to get Jim on the line, and we'll see what his story is all about.
Hello, Stan.
Well, you know it was me. Thank you. Jim, it's good to hear your voice. Trust you're doing well.
I'm doing well, and it's good to hear your voice as well.
It's always good to be heard at this age and stage, as my friend used to say. And by the way, I've been promoting this because I've been looking forward to your story. I obviously know a part of it, but now I'll get more of the complete story. And so the audience has been kind of primed, and I've given it an introduction. And so I'm a good enough broadcaster to know get to the good guest as soon as possible, so let me do just that. Ladies and gentlemen, we have interesting ideas, and this is an interesting title. Here we go with Jim McKay, 13 Days That Almost Ended the World's Humanity as We Know It. Jim, you're on.
Thank you, Stan. I will talk about my personal and family background that led up to my involvement in the Cuban Missile Crisis and the secret mission I led to set up an air defense missile base in the southeastern United States as the crisis unfolded. Many of you who are listening lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, so you will likely hear some things you already know, but I guarantee you will hear some things about the missile crisis that you have not heard before, and just how close we came to the end of humanity as we know it. The Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962, the 13 days that almost ended the world's humanity as we know it. I would like to share with you my personal involvement and personal experiences in the Cuban Missile Crisis, as well as the crisis itself. Perhaps I should best start with my experiences that led up to my involvement in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I graduated from Penn State University and received my commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army in 1960, having completed the university's 4-year Army ROTC program. I was assigned to report to Fort Bliss, El Paso, Texas Air Defense Missile School in January 1961. At Fort Bliss, I went through the following missile schools: Nike Ajax, Nike Hercules, Nike Zeus, and the newest and most advanced missile school, the Hawk Missile School. In addition, I received training in nuclear weapons, as the Nike Hercules missile had a nuclear capability. In September 1961, Upon completing my missile school and nuclear weapons training, I took a leave, returned to Rochester, New York, and Barbara, my wife, and I were married. This year marks our 61st anniversary. We were quartered off post at Fort Bliss as there was no available married housing on post. And in January 1962, I was assigned to the 8th Missile Battalion, 15th Artillery, and transferred to Fort Lewis, Washington as a strike unit for the Far East. We were the first Hawk Air Defense Missile Battalion commissioned by the U.S. Army. Now, this was before Vietnam really erupted. But once again, we were quartered off post as there was no on-post housing available. In early October 1962, October 7th specifically, we had our first child, a son, Scott. And Scott remained in the military hospital for a couple of days after his birth to clear his sinuses. But on his first night home, we got hit with a typhoon, which resulted in our losing all power. As a result of our power being off for a projected long period, the next day we evacuated to a motel not too far away that the typhoon had spared. Now, one of my fellow missile battery officers learned of our dilemma and invited us to move in with his family until our power was restored. Within a couple of days, our power was restored, and we returned home with a week-old baby. The next day or so, we purchased a thank you gift for my fellow officer and his family for taking us in. While at his home, delivering the thank you note, his phone rang, and it was our missile battery captain telling him to report to the missile battery immediately. I figured I'd best go with him, as the captain would likely be calling our home next. Now that is when all hell broke loose for us, and the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis for us. Now at this time, President Kennedy was not publicly commenting on New York Senator Ken Keating's claims that missiles were being installed in Cuba. However, the Pentagon was briefing him on U-2 spy plane overflight pictures over Cuba that revealed for the first time Russian missile bases being installed in Cuba. As a result, he was on the phone to various strategic military units throughout the United States and around the world, ordering them to get ready for deployment. Now, also at that time, China began invading India, and my missile battalion being a strike unit for the Far East, I was not sure where we might be headed. At this point in my career, I had advanced to first lieutenant, still very much a junior grade officer, but had been promoted to executive officer of the Hawk Air Defense Missile Battery and second in command. My captain called me in and told me I would be leading and commanding the Hawk Missile Battery's advance party to establish a missile base to defend a specific area. He did not tell me specifically where, but he said pick 10 to 12 men and be ready to leave in 48 hours, anywhere in the world. The top secret mission would be to secure the land needed for our missile battery's installation, prep the land, secure the needed support such as diesel fuel, quarters, supply chain for ordnance, etc., and be ready to receive our Hawk Air Defense Missile Battery equipment and men 120 strong, in 7 days after landing, wherever that might be. All of this hit 10 days after the birth of our son. Fortunately, Barb's mother had come out to Fort Lewis for the birth of our first, and I had told both Barb and her mom that something big was happening and asked her to stay a couple of extra days. Now, my fire control officer was relatively new, and we had sent him back to Fort Bliss, El Paso, Texas for further training when all this hit. I selected the men for the advance party, and we were told we were leaving but did not know exactly what hour or where we would be going. I had advised Barb to be careful on what she said to anyone on the phone and assume all telephone conversations were being monitored. We commandeered a Boeing 707 of the SeaTac Airport in Seattle, Washington, and left for parts unknown at midnight. I was joined by 3 other missile battery officers from our battalion who were leading their respective advance parties to establish their missile batteries somewhere as well. Now, much like the old television show Mission Impossible, once airborne, each of us were handed a sealed envelope telling each of us where we were headed and our mission, each to a different location in Florida. My mission was to establish a missile base to protect MacDill Air Force Base outside Tampa, Florida. Now, MacDill is the world headquarters for CENTCOM that controls all our current military operations in the Far East and was at that time commanded by General Paul D. Adams, U.S. Army. After I left Fort Lewis, Barb received a telephone call from my fire control officer down at Fort Bliss in El Paso, saying he received orders to return to Fort Lewis immediately. And he called our home at Fort Lewis to speak with me. Barb, my wife, answered the phone, said I was not available, and when he asked how soon does immediately mean, she remembered our conversation to assume that all conversations were being monitored, and she smartly said, immediately means yesterday. The next day, he was at our front door with a baby present. Now that's how his Cuban Missile Crisis started. Our Boeing 707 landed in Chicago for fuel, and then we took off again. My advance party was the first to reach their destination, Tampa, Florida, and we landed around 4 in the morning. The Boeing then took off for other parts of destinations, Patrick Air Force Base around Cape Canaveral, and Homestead Air Force Base in Miami, Florida. When we landed, I had been given a telephone number to call at MacDill Air Force Base, and they sent a large van out to get us. Again, there was no on-base housing available. The Air Force had commandeered the Floridian Hotel in downtown Tampa, kicked all civilians out, and taken it over for military personnel. My advance party was quartered there. I called my captain, as we had agreed, to let him know we had arrived safely. He then placed a call to Barb to let her know we had arrived safely, but did not tell her where we were. Barb and her mom then put our car in storage, ended the lease on our housing, and flew back to Rochester, New York, with what few belongings we had then, and a baby that was less than 3 weeks old. It was Barb's first flight, by the way. After getting everyone settled in, I took my lead sergeant, Sergeant Matthews, to MacDill Air Force Base to see the base commander, a lieutenant colonel. We entered his office, saluted, introduced ourselves, and stated our mission. He asked what we needed and what he could do to help. I said first we needed a car, and we needed so many gallons of diesel fuel delivered in 7 days, a bulldozer to work over the missile site once we found one that would provide the field of cover we needed to protect MacDill from air attack from Cuba, and other miscellaneous equipment. He immediately provided the car for our use in searching out land for the missile site, and Sergeant Matthews and I took off to search the area. I had been authorized to obtain any land that would provide the field of fire we needed to protect MacDill Air Force Base, including even land that was occupied and built upon. If land that was occupied and built upon was selected, I was authorized to seize the land and clear it. Within a short time, I had found and selected land that would be perfect for a missile site to provide air defense for MacDill Air Force Base. It was essentially vacant land, although it had some park-like features and a Civil Air Patrol shack on it. But most of the acreage was undeveloped and full of rattlesnakes. It sat right on the tip of the Tampa Bay Peninsula, provided excellent air defense for attacking low-flying aircraft skimming right over the water for airstrikes on the Air Force Base. We immediately got the bulldozer from the Air Force and began preparing the site for the arrival of our missile battery equipment and men, all of it which was due to arrive by rail from Fort Lewis, Washington within 6 days. Over the next few days, we killed 36 rattlesnakes in the undergrowth, and I'm sure some still remained. Realizing I needed some kind of quarters for our 120 missile battery troops to sleep in, and all they had were shelter halves, I went to the Air Force Base commander and asked if he could supply us with 10 12-man squad tents. He said he would get us the tents. A couple of days went by and I had not received any tents, and my men were getting closer and closer to arriving in Tampa. And I decided, hell, the Air Force sleeps in billets, not tents, and I was not sure the colonel could get me my required tents, and I couldn't have my men just sleeping on the ground with all those rattlesnakes. So I decided to go to General Paul D. Adams at CENTCOM headquarters. He's Army, I'm Army, so let's see if he can help. I walked up to the CENTCOM building and was met by an armed guard. He asked what I wanted. I said I wanted to see General Adams. He asked what for, and I told him. And he said he would take me to his G3 or G4 and march me through the building to the General Staff Officer's office area. I went into a staff officer's office, saluted, told him my mission, and asked his help in getting me 10, 12-men squad tents. He was a bird colonel, and he wheeled around his desk, picked up a red phone, and the next thing I knew, he was talking to the Pentagon. He finished, wheeled around in his desk chair, and said, "Lieutenant, you'll get your tents. Anything more you need?" And I said, "No, sir," thanked him, and left. Now, I figured I got tents coming from the Air Force and the Pentagon. I'm not canceling anything. That night, I received a call from my missile battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel, and he said, "What the hell are you doing, Lieutenant, calling the Pentagon?" And I explained what I had done, and he said, "Get the Pentagon off my back. I'll get you the tents, Lieutenant." I thought, okay, now I have tents promised from 3 sources. I'm not canceling any of them. One of the foremost things I was taught in officer school was always look out for the welfare of your men. And I was not going to have them sleeping on rattlesnake-infested ground. Let's see who delivers. My advance party men continued to prepare the site as a missile base, getting the land ready for the arrival of our Hawk missile battery equipment. Throughout all of my advance party's mission, President Kennedy was receiving daily overflight pictures shot from U-2 spy planes and lower flying aircraft, showing the progress the Russians were making in bringing those bases to operational status. Those photographs showed not only air defense missile bases being installed, but intercontinental missile bases being installed with missiles that could strike most of the United States with a nuclear warhead within minutes after launch. And we, the United States, had no way to intercept them after they were launched. President Kennedy formed an ex-com of his top advisors to assess the situation and determine what he should do. They met daily. The top Air Force general was General Curtis LeMay. He advocated an immediate airstrike, a bombing run, an invasion of Cuba. Bobby Kennedy, the president's brother, and then Attorney General, and on the ExCom, and Bob McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, and he was former president of Ford Motor Company, did not like the idea of an immediate airstrike. They huddled and conceived the idea of a blockade of Cuba. Jack was troubled by the idea of an airstrike, and he anticipated that an airstrike could lead to a Russian countermove in Germany and a Berlin strike. He gradually warmed up the idea of a Cuban blockade. And after much discussion with Bobby and Bob McNamara, a blockade was decided upon as Russian ships carrying more Russian missiles and warheads closed on Cuba. President Kennedy addressed the nation to announce the blockade. Adlai Stevenson, the U.S. representative to the United Nations, was instructed to confront the Russian United Nations representative. That was a dramatic moment when the Russian representative refused to answer our accusation that Russia was installing missiles in Cuba. Stevenson was armed with the U-2 photographs and revealed them at that time for the world to see. The world was shocked. We had the cold evidence. Stevenson awaited the Russian reply. There was none. He stated, "I'll wait for your reply until hell freezes over." President Kennedy had ordered our ships to stop all incoming ships to Cuba, board them, and search their cargo. No armed ships were to be allowed to pass into Cuba. If the ships refused to stop, our ships were ordered to sink the incoming vessels if necessary. The world stood on the brink of war.
Oh my goodness, indeed it did. Thank you, Jim, for that part of the story. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll get right back. I'm Stan Houston. This is Interesting Ideas with Jim McKay, story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This true history story is brought to you by What It Takes Radio and the friends of Jim McKay. What It Takes Radio is a podcasting and publishing company, and we're in the business of helping people reach an audience. And we're particularly in the business of helping people who have extraordinary stories. They were simply ordinary people who lived in extraordinary times, and they have some extraordinary stories to tell. And just as Jim is taking the risk and the adventure of sharing his story, we'd like you to think about doing that for your story. There are many, many people. I meet them all the time, and they have stories to tell and perhaps even legends that they perhaps didn't talk about very much, and things they did that they kind of kept quiet about, but now they think, maybe it's time for me to share my story with others that perhaps my children, my grandchildren, or others might be interested in, and certainly it will play a part in the keeping of the story alive and of keeping history alive for other people who can learn from the stories we tell. So if that's what you are all about, would you reach out to me at What It Takes Radio? Just stanhouston@gmail.com, stanhouston@gmail.com, and let's talk about getting your story on the radio. Okay, Jim, we're ready for the rest of the story.
As I said, Stan, the world stood on the brink of war. Meanwhile, my Hawk Air Defense Missile Battery train arrived from Fort Lewis, Washington with all our men, the radars, launchers, control centers, etc. Our Hawk missile warheads arrived in a separate shipment from Colorado, and we moved them quickly into place we had prepared. And yes, our tents arrived and were immediately erected so the men had quarters to sleep in that first night on site. Now the race began. Get our air defense Hawk missile base operational as quickly as possible and before the Russian missile bases became operational. Now, I was receiving 3 to 4 top-secret crypto-coded messages daily, apprising us of the most current developments. A Russian submarine was off our coast, was submerged, and the Navy was dropping depth charges on it to try to get them to surface. More on that later. Our overflights of Cuba showed Cuban and Russian aircraft wingtip to wingtip on their air bases, an easy airstrike target. President Kennedy, upon seeing those overflight pictures, wondered, what our air bases look like, and ordered an overflight pictures of our air bases, the same wingtip to wingtip configuration, and he immediately ordered our Air Force aircraft dispersed throughout the U.S. region so as not to be a sitting duck for an enemy airstrike. I needed several hundred yards of barbed wire for our missile-based perimeter defense, and I ordered that from the Fort Benning Supply Depot that was directed to supply our needs. A few days later, our missile-based entry guard post called me and said, there's an 18-wheeler truck at the entrance asking for me. I went out to the guard post, and the truck driver asked me, what the hell is going on? I said, why do you ask? And he said, he was driving across the Dakotas with a load of barbed wire to be delivered to a rancher when a state trooper pulled him over and told him to turn his truck around and take that load to Lieutenant McKay at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida, and don't stop. Clearly, in the time of crisis, the Army gets things done. Meanwhile, our Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines were preparing for an invasion. General Curtis LeMay continued to promote the idea of an invasion and an airstrike to take out the Russian missile bases. Our military intelligence had determined the bases were not yet operational, and General LeMay assured Jack he could get them all in one strike. President Kennedy kept asking, but what if you're wrong? And what if our military intelligence is wrong? And one Russian operational intercontinental missile base remains. Then on Saturday, Major Anderson was shot down and killed over Cuba in his U-2. War looked imminent. Jack moved us to DEFCON 2, Defense Condition 2, meaning war is imminent. It's the first and only time the United States has been on DEFCON 2. He ordered that message to all United States troops be made in the clear so Russia could clearly intercept it. On Sunday, the next day, Khrushchev ordered his ships at sea to stop closing on Cuba. A series of messages were quickly exchanged between Washington and Moscow. Then Khrushchev ordered his ships to return to Russia and said he would withdraw the missiles already installed in Cuba. Now, as a secret part of the agreement, President Kennedy agreed to remove our Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which were sitting close to the Russian border. But this part of the agreement was not to be made public, per President Kennedy. The United States had made the decision to withdraw our Jupiter missiles from Turkey, as our nuclear submarines armed with our Polaris missiles were planned to replace the outdated Jupiter missiles anyway. The immediate crisis had ended. However, for the next month, the United States and the United Nations would monitor the withdrawal of the Russian missiles from Cuba. What is generally not known is that the Tuesday following that Sunday when Khrushchev backed down, our airstrikes were scheduled, and a full invasion with paratroopers and land invasion was scheduled to be made on Wednesday. This invasion schedule was based on our military intelligence assessing that the Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles would become operational that Thursday. We could not allow that to happen, as essentially the entire United States would be within their range, and we had no way to stop them once they were launched. Our Hawk missile battery was essentially ready. However, I would have liked to have had an extra day or two just to check everything out, but we were on full alert. Now, only 20 years later, when the United States and Russia exchanged information on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Robert McNamara traveled to Moscow, we found out that the Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles armed with nuclear warheads were already operational that fateful Sunday when Khrushchev and Kennedy reached their agreement to end the Cuban Missile Crisis. Our military intelligence was dead wrong on their assessment that the Russian missiles would not be operational until that coming Thursday. Had we launched the airstrikes and one of their missile bases survived it, they would have launched intercontinental ballistic missiles that could be on Washington, D.C. within 20 minutes or less, and we could not stop them. Additional Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles would have hit every part of the United States except the far northwest Seattle, Washington. The United States Air Force B-52 bombers were in the air carrying nuclear bombs and would have been ordered to completely destroy Russia and the Soviet Union. The entire world would have been involved in a nuclear war. There would have been no safe haven, either bombed with nuclear bombs or the radiation fallout would have ended humanity as we know it. We were, in fact, only 48 hours away from such a fate. Now, many of you may have seen a picture of Major Anderson, the U-2 pilot shot down and killed that Saturday before the fateful Sunday agreement. During the crisis, when I visited Patrick Air Force Base outside Cape Canaveral, I witnessed a U-2 spy plane landing with shot damage when returning from a Cuban overflight. But there is a man that most of you do not know. This is a man that many say saved the world from utter destruction during the Cuban Missile Crisis. His name is Vasily Akopov. Remember I mentioned earlier that a Russian submarine was off our coast and our Navy was dropping test depth charges on it to try to get it to surface? That submarine was armed with nuclear torpedoes, with explosive warhead power equal to the atomic bomb dropped in Japan. And that submarine had 3 Russian officers aboard. When they were being rocked by our depth charges, the entire crew believed war had started. And 2 of the Russian officers aboard also believed war had started and wanted to launch a nuclear-armed torpedo on our aircraft carrier in that area. However, in order to launch a nuclear attack, all 3 Russian officers had to agree. Vasily Akopov refused to authorize the launch of a nuclear torpedo and required the submarine to surface to see what was going on. Now, in those days, subs could not communicate with their command on the surface when submerged. Once they surfaced, they found we were not at war. And to this day, Russia recognizes Vasily Akopov as the man with a cool head who saved the world from nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, just a couple of side stories you might be interested in. The Hawk missile was our most advanced air defense missile at that time. The Hawk missile was the first missile to bring down another missile and rocket, the Honest John rocket. It was the forerunner of our current Patriot missile system and was also made by Raytheon. It had 2 secret radar systems that are no longer secret, so I can tell you about them. One secret radar had a moving target indicator capability, which essentially removed all ground clutter from the radar screen so you could just see the incoming moving targets without any ground interference on the screen. Today, You see the results of that secret radar every evening when you tune in your television and get the Doppler radar weather report. Also, another secret radar of the Hawk missile system was a continuous wave radar. And today, you use that technology every time you use your microwave oven. Remember, the original microwave was called the Amana radar range. Kind of makes you wonder what the military is using today that is secret that will end up in our daily lives tomorrow, doesn't it? Also, as a side story, while Hawk Air Defense missile bases were set up at Tampa, Cape Canaveral, and Miami, the Marines set up Hawk Air Defense missile bases in Key West. The Army also set up a Nike Hercules Air Defense missile base outside Miami. Now, the Nike Hercules missiles have a nuclear warhead capability, but the area of Miami was not cleared for a nuclear weapon as the Cuban Missile Crisis developed too rapidly. A nuclear Hercules missile could be distinguished from a conventional warhead Hercules missile, as the nuclear missile had a red-colored self-aligning static tube nose cone. In order to mislead any Cuban intelligence, the Army painted the nose cones of the non-nuclear Hercules missiles red at their base outside Miami. This served to lead any Cuban or Russian intel personnel seeing photographs taken of the base by news photographers to believe it was a nuclear air defense missile base. Fortunately, we never had to use our missiles. Once the crisis subsided, we were cleared to call our spouses and homes, and I called Barb to see how she and the baby that I last saw when he was 10 days old were doing. She had seen photographs in the newspaper of Hawk missile in Key West and thought that's where I was. I think she was relieved to not only know the crisis was over, but we were all safe and we were in the Tampa Bay, Florida area. Once the crisis was over, President Kennedy visited Hawk missile bases to express his thanks for the job that was done protecting the United States from air attack. All Hawk missile men received the Presidential Meritorious Service Medal and ribbon from President Kennedy for the job that all had done. That coming January, I mustered out of the service at Fort Lewis, Washington, and returned to Rochester, New York, to see my wife that I had not seen in 3 months, and a son who I last saw when he was but 10 days old. Life begins anew, but this time as a civilian. But that's another story. Thanks for listening. God bless.
Well, God bless you. Jim, that's an incredible story. And again, so many things. And to think of the heroes that were involved and the whole idea, you're absolutely right. 48 hours, one misstep, and that would have been the end of it, right?
Right.
Exactly so. Well,
you always, one of the things that President Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy and Bob McNamara were instrumental in doing was realizing you should never back your opponent into a corner, but give the opposition an opportunity to save face. And I think Khrushchev had a very similar view relative to the United States. And fortunately, both President Kennedy and Khrushchev realized that in a nuclear war, there would be no winner. It would be the end of humanity as we know it.
Yes, indeed. And obviously we're in something, I don't know if it's similar in any way, because we don't know, but I hope that God's grace and good sense will prevail in kind of the current climate. I'm sure you join me in that.
Absolutely. I think we have a potential very similar situation in the Ukraine right now between Ukraine and Russia.
Yes. And so God give us good men and women like Jim, who made that happen as a young man. Obviously, it was a long time ago. Jim, part of the reason I do these programs is for some of the people just to know a little bit about our story. Actually, you and I have a mutual friend, and she will go unnamed, but she said this about those of us. Hey, we weren't always young and sick and poor. Sometimes we were pretty good at what we did. And that's obviously fun for us to realize, too. There you were, just a young man, and part of the responsibility of the world was on your young shoulders. So, way to go.
Well, I was only one of many.
Right.
And it was the entire United States Armed Forces at the ready point in Defense Condition 2, that really stood our ground at that time, and it was apparent to Premier Khrushchev at the same time that the world stood on the brink of war.
And he also knew that he was dealing with a strong enemy if he had to, right? That's important.
Right.
You know, young men were doing good things. And I was younger than you, but I remember that in college as we were wondering just what was going to happen to many of us. Well, you know, there are a number of people, Jim. Like you said, there were many others. And, hey, you know, it might be fun to see if somebody else has a story like this. So with your permission, Jim, I'm just going to suggest that if there's anybody who hears this story and they'd like to kind of share their story, and perhaps maybe a group of the oldsters from the Cuban Missile Crisis might have a little bit of at least a virtual reunion. So if you have heard this story and perhaps you would like to know something more about it or tell your story, again, with your permission, just reach out to me. Don't bother Jim. He's busy doing other good things right now. But if you'd like to reach out to interesting ideas, go just to stanhouston@gmail.com, stanhouston@gmail.com. And why don't you tell us a little bit about your great story? And perhaps there might be some connections between those of us and those of you, particularly, who were in that situation, but more importantly, you were in the situation that perhaps kept the world still in place. So God bless you for doing that, and we'd love to hear your story. That's okay with you, Jim?
Absolutely.
That's great. Well, Jim, thank you so very, very much. He also has some other very interesting stories. As he said, he went on to, as we said, with the Kodak company and very much involved in some of the celebrity culture and the corporation in Hollywood. And again, like he would say, that's another story, and maybe we can get him to tell us more about that sometime. Jim, thank you so much for being a part of our program. All the best and blessings to you, and give our regards to Barb, and we'll all be in touch. Best and blessings to all. Yeah, best and blessings to all of us, and bye for now.